supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello, I'm Admiral Lord West. Thank you for downloading Britain at Sea, my history of the Royal Navy in the 20th century from BBC Radio 4. In 1904, the Royal Navy was at a crossroads. The Navy's greatest fan and its sternest critic, Admiral Sir John Fisher, had just been installed as its professional head, and over the next 6 years he directed a revolution which had profound consequences for the service he loved so much, for Britain, and ultimately for the world. Fisher had long believed that the Royal Navy had become complacent and lazy and had lost the fighting spirit of the Nelsonian era. In the previous decade, he had succeeded in transforming the Mediterranean fleet from one obsessed with polishing and painting, and instead towards preparation for war. He had begun to tackle the culture of mistaking social standing for ability, and he had overseen the development of new ships and the technology they carried. Now, as First Sea Lord, he pressed for further rapid progress in all three. But he saw technology as the key to a navy so powerful, so fearsome, that no one would dare challenge it. The second half of the 19th century had seen a technological revolution. When Fisher began his career, it was on board ships whose basics hadn't changed much in 200 years, but just 50 years later, when he became First Sea Lord, developments in every kind of technology had poured forth, from wireless telegraphy and rifled gun barrels to torpedoes, oil fuel, submarines and aircraft. And one of the most groundbreaking, which changed the face of naval warfare forever, is commemorated here in Gosport. I'm at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum, and I'm here to meet its archivist, George Malcolmson. Wow, this is amazing. I haven't seen the submarine in this new home. Here she is, Holland 1. Now, George, could you tell us why exactly did we buy this submarine?
Well, the Royal Navy was never very keen on submarines, but in 1901 we decided that we needed to obtain a submarine to try and develop anti-submarine techniques and weapons. And very quickly it became apparent that the effect of having submarines around made such a difference to the way surface ships acted that we embarked on a large submarine building program.
Because, of course, they were seen initially very much as a defensive measure, weren't they? As I understand it, Jackie Fisher thought, is this some way of saving money from fixed minefields, all that sort of thing?
Yes, and that evidence was fairly quickly forthcoming. The inspecting captain of submarines was making his reports as early as 1903 to tell the Admiralty how effective the submarine was and how it could be a cheaper option.
So that report actually was in the same year as the first ones we were operating. So it was all done very rapidly indeed.
Very, very quickly. And I have the report here, and you can see that some of the statements that were being made that changed the way that the surface fleets would operate. This was apparent very, very quickly. But it wasn't up until the First World War, where the submarine was used in action for the first time, that the full potential of submarines were realised.
And I think what this shows, I'm looking at this report now, is that these were things that were amazingly offensive. And as we all know, the way to sink a ship is knock a hole in its bottom. And of course, suddenly, here we had a mechanism and a way of actually achieving that. It totally changed naval warfare in that relatively short period.
As the submarine affected the way the coast blockade, that is, putting ships near an enemy's coast and intercepting their ships and trade, this was no longer feasible. Mines, torpedoes, submarines, and so the whole way that warfare was conducted had to be radically rethought. Even the thought of a submarine being present would affect the way ships would operate, and this was a very powerful force working on the surface fleets.
But of course there's always been a piratical aspect to submariners.
There were discussions taking place about how submarines couldn't obey the rules of warfare. that were current under the Hague Convention. The very idea that a submarine would attack an unarmed merchant ship, Winston Churchill said that no civilized country
Yes, without
would
warning.
do this.
Without warning.
Yes. So the submariners were threatened with this repercussions of being hanged as pirates. It was one way to deal with that, but that never happened, and the submariners instigated the flying of the skull and crossbones, very much against the Admiralty's wishes for the Royal Navy
And
submarine
this
service.
slides to the present day when I was told not to let one of my submarines fly a skull and crossbones coming back on patrol, and I told it was to, and the Secretary of State was very annoyed with me, but I think he understood finally.
I'm sure they thank you for it.
But whilst Fisher was willing to look at the possibilities of submarines, aircraft, wireless telegraphy, he realised that the core of the Navy was still the battle fleet, and that had to be upgraded. The result was HMS Dreadnought, launched across the water at Portsmouth in 1906. Dreadnought was a technological and industrial tour de force, bringing together new technologies and built with a speed that no other nation on earth could rival at the world's greatest dockyard. So she was also a political statement. You might call her an early experiment in shock and awe. And I'm going to drive just up the coast to another part of Gosport, where I've arranged to meet an old naval pal of mine, John Roberts, to talk about the impact of Dreadnought. Hello, John. Very good to see you again.
Hello, Admiral. Welcome to Explosion, the Museum of Naval Warfare and Naval Firepower.
Well, I can certainly see as a gunnery officer, it's terribly exciting. I'm looking at a whole raft of shells, some of them quite gigantic, and this looks like a 12-inch shell in front of me, a really huge piece of metal, and which would, of course, been filled with explosive, which I think was the type of gun that was fired from Dreadnought. Could you tell me why Dreadnought was so revolutionary?
Indeed, Dreadnought really transformed naval warfare rather like the tank did on land warfare. Three big things. First and most important, because she was the first all-big gunship. Secondly, she had revolutionary engines. She had steam turbines as opposed to the reciprocating engines. She was much faster, and also, of course, the steam turbines were much more reliable, so she could go for a sustained time at high speed. And then the third thing was the incredible speed with which she was built. Just over a year was an enormous achievement which made the Germans just sit up because their shipbuilding just could not match that. And this set ablaze the big naval armament race with Germany, who was determined to keep up with us. And once we'd launched Dreadnought, she had to have Dreadnoughts and better Dreadnoughts. And as she built her Dreadnoughts, we progressively had to build more, bigger and more powerful Dreadnoughts.
For us, supremacy at sea was fundamental for our survival. For them, it was just nice to have.
Absolutely. As a maritime nation, totally dependent on trade, the Navy was our first and often last line of security, and any threat to that was a grave threat.
I think we forget today that a dreadnought was the most devastating weapon of war, the most powerful thing really in the world, and it made every other battleship obsolete. The public loved the technology because to them it was extremely high tech, really exciting, and as you say, the power, and there was a demand for more ships. And the Liberals had their election campaign in Portsmouth across the water from here, disrupted by crowds shouting, "Dreadnought, Dreadnought, Dreadnought." And of course there was this absolutely marvellous quote by a Liberal where he said the Admiralty had demanded 6, the Treasury said we could only afford 4, so we compromised with 8, which I think was a marvellous expression of how frustrated they were. That despairing Liberal, who had seemed to care so little about the Navy, was soon at the Admiralty as its new First Lord. His name? Winston Churchill. And within months of taking up his post, he was looking at changing one of the most fundamental aspects of ships at sea, but that seems so boring, that is, their fuel. The mobility of a ship is crucial for its fighting capability. For centuries, it had been the wind. By the mid-19th century, coal was absolutely essential, and the Admiralty, looked around the world to find the very best coal and had a series of competitions in the mid-19th century. And they decided that the Welsh coal from the valleys, some 20 miles to the north of where I'm standing at the moment in Cardiff Docks, was the best coal in the world. I'm walking here into the Pierhead building in Cardiff Docks and saying hello to Fionn Evans. Hello, Fionn, who's part of the visitor relations staff in the building here. And Fionn, perhaps you could tell us the significance of this building and the Welsh coal industry.
Yes, well, it was built in 1897 and it was the headquarters for the Bute Railway Company, which shipped all the coal from the valleys all the way down to Cardiff, which shipped the coal all over the world because that's the coal that everybody wanted to use.
And all of that was helped by the fact that the Admiralty had chosen this coal above all other coal in the world as Admiralty Best Welsh, the coal that they wanted to use.
Yes, exactly. Everybody wanted the valley's coal.
Coalin', 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 always bloody well coalin'.
This was all to come to an end with the introduction of oil, which burnt much hotter, which had no residue, which gave you a higher calorific value so you could move faster in your ship, and which was much, much easier to transfer down pipelines and didn't demand the whole ship's company to actually refuel the ship.
Coalin' ship 3 times a week till all our energy spent.
But Churchill's decision to go for oil had huge implications internationally. Britain needed a secure supply, and unlike coal, we didn't have oil on our mainland, and Churchill's eyes turned towards the Middle East. Daniel Jurgen has written a definitive history of oil.
The Royal Navy's decision to convert to oil was momentous both for the Royal Navy, for its capabilities and flexibilities in the 20th century, and it was also a momentous decision because it really meant the entry of oil into strategic decisions. Oil went from being just something that would be used to power these first automobiles, to be used for lighting, to really became the fuel of national power.
And how important do you think this decision is to how the Middle East has developed since then?
Oh, that's a very big question. In converting the Royal Navy from coal to oil and proceeding to assure an oil supply, Churchill said that the prize of the venture was world mastery itself, and indeed, that's where I got the title for my book, The Prize, because I thought that that quote really captured what it's all about. But once the decision was made, it meant that Britain was no longer depending upon Welsh coal for its Royal Navy, but rather upon oil supplies, and they happened to come from this distant country, Persia, Iran, raising all sorts of questions about security and reliability of supply. But it did mean a kind of pivot towards the Middle East. And coming out of the First World War, which had really confirmed Churchill's vision or his understanding of the importance, strategic importance of oil, that's when countries really started to focus on the Middle East and its resources. And that was a real beginning of the Middle East's role that it has today as such a central source of oil upon which the world depends.
These years of technological development, social change, and Anglo-German naval confrontation were the high point of the British love affair with the Royal Navy. And in the next programme, I'll look at how that relationship was tested with the coming of war, and how our current understanding of the Great War seriously understates the role of the Royal Navy in winning victory. You've been listening to Britain at Sea from BBC Radio